So, you've come to hear me tell a story, have you?
If you please, we would love to hear one of your stories. You have seen so much. You have lived so long.
At the time of writing, I finished The Longest Journey yesterday, and I'm still sitting here swimming in a flood of thoughts and feelings about it. Not least of which are concerning if it's actually possible to edit some kind of interesting video together out of all my capture, considering I played through a large chunk of the game with the subtitles switched off, and there are just huge sections of footage where nothing happens, while I sit and try to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do next. I may have to do a few reshoots. Mostly though, the story is absolutely incredible. I mean, this really is top quality writing, the likes of which often feels lost in today's bland modern shooters, soulless formulaic open worlds, cynical live service grinds, and endless nostalgia bait. Because even big producers and publishers can't come up with any better ideas than what we had 20 years ago. Developed by Norwegian studio Funcom, yes, these guys, and with the lead designer Ragnar Tornquist, this guy easily wins the prize for the most awesome name ever. This game and its sequels are games that I should have finished a long time ago. In fact, I've had 2 or 3 full starts on this since I bought the special edition of Dreamfall for PC, which also came packaged with the original game. My 2 favourite genres, you see, are fantasy, and I'm not talking about Tolkien-esque fantasy of elves and orcs either. I'm talking about Neil Gaiman and Philip Pullman levels of weirdness, with talking animals, bottles that can capture the wind, talking trees, and whatever this is. My other favourite genre is dystopian cyberpunk, the likes of which was first conceived in Gibson's Sprawl trilogy, and one of my all-time favourite books, Snow Crash. And what else do I love? Magic doors. Portal fantasy. Or isekai as all the kids say these days, because if it's not from Japan, then apparently it just ain't cool. What? So, could you imagine a game where the story is about a hero from a dystopian cyberpunk future who gets sucked through a magic door into a high fantasy world and goes on a Chosen One style quest across a magical fairy kingdom with dragons, talking sloths and bird people before returning to her world to blast off into space and fight a chaotic demon cloud to decide the fate of 2 worlds? Sounds like this was written specifically for me, right? Which is exactly why I finally made myself finish the damn thing after all this time. So, if the story is so amazing, what's the problem? Well, we'll get to that in good time. But for now, let's start positively and meet our hero April and learn a little about her worlds. This is The Longest Journey. So let's be clear here. The Longest Journey is a story-first adventure game, and it is one hell of a story. So much so that I have no intention or even a desire to talk about it here. This is 100% something you should discover for yourself by playing the game and taking the journey with its protagonist, April Ryan. I am so convinced of this one fact, that if you are here for anything other than nostalgia purposes and have not played this game yet, then I'm telling you 100% to close this video and go play the game first. Even though I won't be doing heavy spoilers for the main story arc, I really think this is something best experienced as it was intended first. It's not perfect by any stretch. It has very dated visuals that, while incredibly charming to the likes of me, may be off-putting to others, and it is an old-school point-and-click adventure game, warts and all. But if you can get past all that, then I can assure you right now that The Longest Journey is a journey worth taking. A quick aside concerning playing it though. While this game does run fine on Windows 10, that is to say it doesn't crash, there are some graphical issues, and for that reason and many others I strongly recommend installing the HD mod available on this site. As well as cleaning and scaling up all this game's textures, it also irons out a lot of issues and glitches the base game has. To be clear, you must install this before you start your game, as it moves the save game folder, and any save games you have from before when it was installed will not work for the HD version. As much as I enjoy playing old school games as they were intended, I can promise you that this one is worth it, and clearly a lot of effort went into bringing it to life. So a huge thank you to everyone who worked on this mod. And with that out of the way, why don't we visit a couple of worlds and meet a young lady named April? So, without labouring the point, The Longest Journey starts, as most great stories of prophesized heroes do, far, far in the past when everything was bigger and better, and we all went too far too quickly. So, it's a little cliche, but honestly, The Longest Journey is such a love letter to so many fantasy novels and comics that I can't really fault it for wearing its inspirations on its sleeves. And this story and world is so jam full of original ideas that I guess having a start like something out of the Silmarillion isn't such a bad thing overall. The very short version of the story states that in the beginning, the logical forces of science and the mystical powers of magic existed in one world. In this united reality, the power to literally make the stars dance was within our grasp, and as usual, humans came along and decided to abuse this power, setting in motion cataclysmic events that would lead to the eventual destruction of everything. At some point in our planet's past, 4 nomads from the stars known as Drikekin, or eventually dragons, came across this world and put their heads together on the dilemma before deciding that the only way to solve this was to divide the one world into 2. Out of this, the twin worlds of Stark and Arcadia were born, with Stark being our own world of logical laws, science and technology, and Arcadia being a magical realm of talking fish people and things straight out of the Grimm brothers' nightmares. Once separated, the forces of magic and science posed no danger to each other, and the balance between them would be observed and regulated by a mortal guardian who would stand between them for 1,000 years before handing over his mantle to the next guardian and returning to their body to live out the rest of their lives. Of course, if this process was all fine and dandy, then we wouldn't have much in the way of a game now, would we? And as such, forces have conspired to corrupt this process, end the balance, and completely shake up April Ryan's life right around the time when she really needs to get her final paintings done for her senior year exhibition. Our fine arts major, you see, is one of the few people gifted with the power to shift between Stark and Arcadia at will, though she hasn't exactly figured out how to use that power yet. I see you, MCU. I see your blatant plagiarism. As such, it's up to her to take a very long journey across Arcadia, gather up a bunch of ancient and difficult to find MacGuffins to open a portal into the realm of the Guardian, and try to put a stop to whatever is causing all this trouble in the first place. So, it's not exactly the most original setup, and I'll talk more on my feelings about Chosen One scenarios in the next video, but it's very gamey. It lays out some clear objectives and sends you on a path to get them, which is nothing more than an excuse for the writer to take you on a tour of the world they've created, and what a couple of worlds they are. So this is April. April is, well, the girl's a mess. Just look at her room. If our living space is some kind of representation of our psychological state, well, I'm worried for this girl. She's clearly low on income given the size of the box she lives in, and she's not exactly keeping the place clean and tidy either. We learn early on that April is a broke-ass art student, and the sketches strewn around her room confirm not only this, but the frustrating creative block she's dealing with as her final exhibition draws ever closer. Inside her wardrobe we don't find a lot, and she comments that this was all she could grab when she left, or rather ran away from home, which implies all kinds of underlying trauma, to say nothing of the very vivid dreams she's been having lately concerning talking trees, dragons, and, well, whatever the fuck this thing is. Our first day with April is really just a tour of her regular life, and a chance to meet the people who are a part of it. She lives in a town called Venice, which is a progressive bohemian area dedicated to culture and art in the city of Newport, which, as we can see, is a massive sci-fi megalopolis that spreads out and up to the heavens, and I wouldn't be surprised to find out it also goes down deep into the Earth's crust either. Here she attends university as an art student. When we actually get to the university, we can see that April is a mess of insecurities. She's constantly comparing herself to her peers, and clearly she feels inadequate. which is compounded by the fact she hasn't been able to paint anything worth a damn in forever. She works part-time as a waitress in some hipster bar alongside this absolute hunk of meat, a dance major named Charlie, a man she's so convinced is too good for her that she's friend-zoned him in order to avoid any risk of harm to herself. She has an arsehole boss with a heart of gold, and a best friend named Emma, who's everything April thinks she's not. Emma wears short skirts and gets all the attention, while April has to deal with this arsehole hitting on her.
If I wasn't such a fucking nice guy, I'd smash your fucking face in, bitch. You're gonna be so fucking sorry you ever fucked with me, April fucking Ryan.
I will say that I don't think April's relationship with Emma is toxic. In the late game, Emma really comes through for April in a way that only a true friend would. So, why am I talking about any of this? Why aren't we talking about dragons, spaceships, and alchemists that are also world champion hopscotch players? No, really. There's one in the game. Well, because this is damn good character writing, which, aside from some blissfully optional dialogues full of heavy-handed backstory, is all delivered through the course of you taking April through her first day. April seems real to me. I can completely relate to her situation. I was a broadcast student once myself. I've worked dead-end serving jobs, envied my friends who could hook up with a new girl every night while I could barely crawl out from beneath my own insecurities. I've sat in a tiny room with those closest to me and dreamed about what my future might be like. And I have struggled to write 2 words of an essay until the night before the deadline. I know who this girl is because once upon a time, I was her.
I know who you are, boy, because you're me.
The main difference here is that at that time in my life, being a long-time reader, I'd have given my right eye and died on the world tree to have fate come knocking at my door and throw a purpose on my lap, especially one with magic doors and fantastical other worlds to contend with. After all, I basically felt rejected by the world I was occupying. At least if I'd had something like that going on, it might have felt like it made a little more sense at the time. Well, as a lover of all kinds of fantasy stories, I like to imagine I'd leap at the chance to be part of one. But I suspect the real prospect of alternate realities rife with magic and danger will be less exciting and more absolutely terrifying. So, that's April. This is our hero. She's not physically strong or gifted in magic, she's not confident and skilled in battle, and she's not all that quick-witted either. But she's very believable and easy to root for. And because this is a very well-written story, I'm sure you can imagine she's going to change in all sorts of ways before it ends. April's journey sees her travelling across the cyberpunk dystopia of Stark and the beautiful and fantastical world of Arcadia. She is tasked with doing incredibly dangerous and absurd things, and to be clear, she is anything but competent about it. Actually, she's downright clueless at the best of times. To demonstrate, at an early point in the game, while on her homeworld of Stark, April needs to track down a runaway kid in a very dangerous part of Venice. And when she does find him, well, she quickly realizes just how unprepared she is for the situation.
A nice, pretty girl like you in a neighborhood like this, asking all the wrong questions. You're heading for some serious trouble, you know.
I can take care of myself.
Sure you can. The thing is, there are 4 guys waiting downstairs for you to come back out, and they can take care of themselves real good.
Later in the game, in Arcadia, April is tasked with killing a shark-like creature called a snapjaw. This is all part of fulfilling some ancient prophecy so that she can be granted special treatment among one of the magical races of Arcadia. At this stage, she's gotten kind of used to this kind of absurdity, and is just trying to push on through to the other side of things. When the dust has settled, however, and she plucks a tooth from the snapjaw to return with as proof of her victory, well, she suddenly realizes just how much danger she'd been in only a matter of minutes before.
This tooth will do just fine. Oh man, that's sharp. I had no idea Snapjaw had razor teeth. If I did, better not think about that now.
One of the most memorable moments in the game concerns an alchemist, a flying castle, moving stairways, and living statues. You see, an alchemist named Roper Clax has stolen and sealed up the wind, making it impossible for ships to sail out into the ocean. Most people in Arcadia are too afraid to stand against a powerful alchemist for fear of what might happen to them. April, on the other hand, doesn't have the first clue what might happen to a girl who stands against a powerful alchemist, leading her to just march over there, walk through the front door, and talk to him. And this is, in fact, all it takes. Well, there's a calculator as well. There's something to be said for the heroism found in blissful ignorance. In truth, April rarely displays the kind of competence we associate with legendary heroes. She seems to stumble through most of her dramatic encounters versus skillfully beating her enemies with wits or combat prowess. Part of this is definitely down to the story's somewhat satirical leaning. This isn't a balls-to-the-wall comedy like some classic point-and-click adventures such as Simon the Sorcerer, but it's self-aware and not trying to take itself too seriously. Think less Terry Pratchett and more Neil Gaiman. There's also a degree of Deus Ex Machina at work here too. April is a chosen one after all, and in one section, the story's narrator, whom we briefly meet at the start of the game, literally pulls April out of the story she's telling into her house because
that's how the story goes, April.
At the same time though, there's something very believable about this girl stumbling completely unaware into dangerous situations and somehow escaping out of blind luck and a simple lack of comprehension regarding how much danger she's actually in. April may be a chosen one, but in her mind she's just trying to fix some problems in her life that she didn't ask to deal with. Not that she's indifferent to the fate of the world, she clearly cares, but given the sharp alteration she's been given to her perspective, she was clearly happier when all she had to worry about was her art exhibition. As such, she's just trying to get to the other side of this as a means to uncomplicate her life. So yeah, the writing is somewhat satirical, but in its own way it all kinda makes sense. It's only when April returns back to Stark and needs to deal with armed militia and also has to deal with the risk of harm to the people closest to her that we see some of the fear we'd expect to find in a young girl who's in way over her head. So, you may think I'm pretty taken with April at this point. You might even think that I've become romantically attracted to her, and maybe even gone so far as to research the legal process of marrying Code and Pixels. And you'd be right. Yeah, let's transition out of this one. I guess we should talk about Stark first, since that's basically where we start. Admittedly, we see a lot less of this world than we do Arcadia, but what we do see reveals quite the intricate little tale overall. And it's something we uncover layer by layer, starting with the safety and comfort of April's room, and progressing into the cold emptiness of space. In truth, Old Venice, where the game starts, aside from one voice-activated computer, which isn't so uncommon these days, this really could be anywhere in the world of the late 90s and early 2000s. April lives in this cute student boarding house, populated by a diverse cast of young students with their heads full of hope, and run by a lesbian couple, one of whom can't shut up about her sex life.
You think so, darling? Yes, I guess we do. And the sex is amazing.
Exploring this area, we can see nice parks, cute coffee shops, and even a quaint little hipster art gallery where we get into some deep ruminations on the nature of art.
How can a painting have a soul?
It has a soul because it has an identity. It has a heart.
And then we get to Metro Central in Newport and... my god, did I just wake up in the Matrix or something? Here we see the very quintessential sprawling cyberpunk dystopia. A vast megalopolis stacked and packed on top of itself, with a sky full of flying cars, brutal armed militia patrolling the streets, and a horizon lit up by neon lights like it's Tokyo on any given night of the week. In both Venice and Metro Central, we start to see signs of a somewhat fascist oppression. The militia here does not mess around, and this is something we get a real taste of later in the game too. The police are not a publicly funded government service that exists for the protection of the people in Stark, though some might argue they aren't that now either, but rather a privately owned militia who, along with arresting and incarcerating criminals, are also required to advertise the products of their parent companies.
We're here to protect, serve, and to inform you of the fantastic range of products offered by Bokemba Mercer and Bingo.
Moving into the less cared for and seedier areas of the city, we also encounter scenes with something like a film noir vibe, as well as exploring ancient abandoned industrial warehouses and buildings. It's like this whole area of the city was just forgotten one day, something that I simply can't imagine happening here in Japan with space at such a premium. Later in the game, we are transported into the decadent upper city. This place is largely cut off from the lower city by strict security. Much like the enclaves in Invisible War, there are very specific doors and elevators that separate the haves from the have-nots, showing the extreme to which class divide has now been taken. I mean, it's almost like natural light and clean air are now a privilege of only the wealthy. We only catch a glimpse of this pristine upper world, but the contrast to parts of Lower Newport are literal night and day, especially when you consider that, much like Midgar in Final Fantasy VII, the lower city is almost in the perpetual shadow of the upper. We only get a brief taste of how the other half live though, and we learn about the outer space colonization process. It seems people are encouraged to volunteer to join the new off-world colonies. They'll be given a home, a job, a new life, and all they ask in return is decades of slavery, indentured servitude, to front the costs of getting them there. Wow, that sounds eerily familiar. I still need to play that game, though Salt Factory's take on it wasn't very flattering. We are introduced to Arcadia for the first time during a dream that April is having at the start of the game, and even in these first pre-rendered backgrounds, we are met with a truly fantastical world of breathtaking alien landscapes, talking trees that take care of eggs, a magnificent white dragon, and a hint of our primary conflict. This really isn't your standard European fantasy world of orcs, elves, and barbarians. Honestly, it's always baffled me that copying one man's interpretation of Scandinavian folklore actually became its own genre, rather than grounds for all kinds of lawsuits. While I do love a good high fantasy adventure, especially if it goes out of its way to subvert a lot of cliches, just ripping off Tolkien and changing all the names Mr. Gygax is not only unoriginal, but also completely stifling to a genre that's supposed to be as limitless as someone can imagine. Thank God for writers like these. We make two other significant trips to this magical world. First by stepping through a magical door seemingly created by an old and somewhat mysterious Native American hobo, and at a later time when April is literally sucked in there through her wardrobe. As I said before, this game wears its influences on its sleeves, and I had a blast picking out as many of them as I could possibly find. Again, much like with Stark, Arcadia is revealed to us in layers. Sure, this odd interior we find ourselves in at the start of our first trip there is as far removed from anything we've seen in Newport as possible, but it's nothing to when we finally step out the door and... Man, did I just wake up in the Matrix again? We get to explore Mercuria in both the light of day and at night when it's alive with festivities. And look, I'm going to spend some time gushing over these pre-rendered backgrounds later, but spoiler alert, man does it get better as the games progress. It seems to draw cultural influences from all over the world, which makes sense as it's a major port city. Moving around we can visit a Persian-style bazaar, a port full of colossal galleons, and later even ye olde taverns. Oh, and there's also this one house inside a tree. Yeah, actually a thing. Adorable, really. Just beyond the walled borders of the city, we can visit a colossal library built into a mountain, rolling English countryside, dense forests inhabited by things both friendly and terrible, and a floating castle because at this point, why the hell not? It even has a moving staircase puzzle straight out of the Labyrinth movie. But it's the people who make up the place, and the creatures that inhabit this magical world are, well, they're just magical. April's journey takes her trekking all across Mercuria and a good chunk of the rest of Arcadia, and this land is filled with creatures both abstract and strange. And while we only spend a brief time with each of them, we discover a rich and diverse collection of cultures, all living together in a jumbled hodgepodge of a mess that somehow all fits together perfectly. Kind of like a natural ecosystem full of its own conflicts and alliances. While there are numerous magical races within the realm of Arcadia, there are 5 specific ones that are critical to April's journey, as they each possess one of several MacGuffins that she needs for her quest. These are the subterranean Banda, the aquatic Merim and their sworn enemies the Garuda-like Elation, the time-displaced Venar, and the mysterious book-collecting Dark People. We are exposed to considerable slices of their cultures and histories, and this all unfolds quite organically, while April runs about the world trying to piece together all the things necessary to save it from complete annihilation. Probably the 2 most interesting races we encounter, though not by any means my favourite, are the Merim and the Elation. We encounter the Merim first, when April is left shipwrecked in the middle of the ocean with nowhere to go. And they seem to rescue her. I say seem to because on one hand, they take her to their city deep beneath the ocean, and even impart with her the ability to breathe underwater and communicate with them. On the other hand, they seem to expect that April will now spend the rest of her life within their city, and head out into dangerous waters filled with shark-like snapjaws to basically bring back food for them. And while we don't see any other humans down here, it's implied she's not the only one, and, well, isn't that basically slavery? I mean, April isn't exactly imprisoned, but even with her ability to breathe underwater, it's not like she has any idea of where to go, or any hope of swimming under her own power to get to safety. After all, who knows what's down here in the Arcadian deep? The Elation we meet later, and they are a race of storytellers. Their culture is quite interesting in that while they do share their stories verbally, each Elation tells the story in their own words. In this way, the stories are actually very much alive and free to change and adapt to become relevant to the world in which they are being told. Since these stories are in fact used as part of the Elation's education, it actually makes a lot of sense that each generation should change the stories and maybe even their meanings somewhat, since society and even morality is something that changes over time. After all, a long time ago, public executions of criminals were considered great entertainment in a lot of countries, so I suspect the morality those people held to, and the stories they might tell to each other based on that morality, are quite different to the ones we make now. When you think about it in that way, it really gives the idea of basing your moral compass off some ancient book written by unknown parties some perspective. At the point in time where we meet them, the Merim and the Elation have long been at war, for so long in fact that neither really knows how it actually started. Generations have passed, and this is just the way it's always been for the current ones. So it's quite a big revelation when April discovers that these 2 species actually share a common ancestor, and once had something of a symbiotic relationship, providing food and protection for each other. We even uncover an ancient village that was once occupied by them. Of course, this all could probably be fixed by their very real and very existing god, the Blue Dragon, that actually sleeps deep beneath the ocean, but he apparently has no interest in helping the people who came to this world with him, or anyone else for that matter.
I wish to be left alone.
Psh. Gods, am I right, guys? We also meet the mole-like Banda, harmless little subterranean creatures that sing to the soil, the Dark People whom we learn very little of in this game, but I'll talk more about in the Dreamfall video. Yeah, that's definitely happening. And my favourite little misfit, Abnaxus. We don't get to spend much time with him in this game, but the dude lives in this adorable treehouse. Abnaxus is a Venar, and these creatures experience time as a single moment. Now, ignoring the fact that this may very well be how the universe actually works, and our simple fleshy brains feed this linear progression of causality to us as a way of not blowing up, this is a pretty cool concept for a character. Abnaxus is somewhat talented among his people for being able to bring himself into a single moment, and underwent extensive training so that he could act as an ambassador for his kind. However, his somewhat unique perspective of reality makes him pretty hard to communicate with.
I'm sorry, but could you try to be a little less obtuse this time? I have a hard time understanding half of what you say.
I will beg for your forgiveness, April Ryan. I had a hard time to make myself understood amongst other peoples.
I sort of wonder what kind of language a race like this would have, or if they'd have one at all. After all, if they know all of their interactions and how it's all going to go, is there anything left for them to talk about? Abnaxus comments that his time among the regular people is very stressful for him, and he expresses a yearning for his home and a return to his natural state. He's quite the charming little creature, and I'm very curious about his people and their way of life. Now, these are just a small sample of the many weird and wonderful creatures we find in Arcadia. We catch a glimpse of the stick people, for example, that are children of the Mother Tree, and have decided to build a crossbow to launch themselves to the moon. There's the terrifying Gribbler and the mysterious Drikekin, or dragons that play a significant part in the main story. Everywhere we look in Arcadia, we are met with so much fairy tale wonder and imagination and straight up magic. This is an absolutely fantastic world to explore, and I'm so glad that I finally got around to doing it. Presentation is something that I, oddly enough, feel like I've already done a pretty good job of showing off here. This story and this world is told just as much through what we see on the screen as it is through the somewhat heavy-handed exposition we'll talk about later. Stories of this nature are as much about going on a tour de force of the creator's imaginary world as they are about finding Excalibur and saving the princess. See also any story with a protagonist with amnesia. So, I guess we should talk about things from a technical point of view. Graphically speaking, The Longest Journey isn't great. Well, the 3D characters aren't. The backgrounds, on the other hand, oh my god, the backgrounds. Okay, one thing at a time. Released in 1999 for the PC, this is 1 year before the PlayStation 2 showed up and graphical potential really exploded. That being said, Grim Fandango released a whole year before this game and was made on a similar budget, and that game really holds up visually even now. This is in part due to its incredibly stylized visuals, which make it almost timeless in that regard. But yeah, you can see here that our characters are very blocky. That's not a problem for me exactly. As an older guy reliving his youth through creating nostalgia YouTube content, this kind of stuff is very charming for me, and no doubt at the time no one was complaining about the way the game looked. Despite working with very clear limitations in polygon count, the various creatures and people in this world all stand out and communicate exactly what needs to be said. I look at this guy and I see a ship captain with a swagger. Here's an old guy who's probably got a few stories to tell. This is terrifying. Here's an evil wizard. Some adorable mole people and mysterious magical beings. This is one of the reasons why I really enjoy revisiting older games. It's just amazing to see what could be accomplished with such a minimal palette in terms of character and creature design. But more so than that, I'm such a huge sucker for pre-rendered backgrounds. Actually, there's this account on Twitter. Yes, I'm on Twitter. Throw me a follow there if you want to see more random musings from me. It's called pre-rendered backgrounds, and that's literally all they post. 2 or 3 times a day, every day, they share a shot of a background from a game and tell you the game it's from. As a lover of retro games and a 3D artist myself, I can't tell you how much this lightens my mood when I see them. It's just as fun seeing locations from games I know as it is ones I don't. There's a hell of a lot of visual storytelling going on here though. None of these scenes were thrown together in any kind of random fashion. They didn't just make a theatre for you to find a character in. They really thought about what an old analog theatre might be like in a modern dystopian sci-fi setting, and did their best to create a mood and atmosphere and tell a story with that scene. They also used pre-rendered cutscenes to handle scenery animation, which is another little thing I love. I probably saw this kind of thing for the first time in either Resident Evil or Final Fantasy VII, but it works just great here too. So yeah, the presentation is showing its age in places, but I think a lot of it still holds up just fine. It may put off younger players from giving it a try, but that's what remakes and remasters are for, right? A man can hope. I know this part was pretty short, but that's because I feel the presentation weaves so well into the story and the mechanics that I feel I've got it adequately covered between those two areas. So let's move on to that last part. So mechanically speaking, The Longest Journey is a point-and-click adventure game, and that's probably all I need to say on the matter. Seriously, If you've played even one other point-and-click adventure game, then you know exactly how this game plays. In fact, I usually wait until I've finished a game before I do any serious writing about it, but I started writing this part when I was on chapter 4 of 12. I was so certain that I got it all figured out that I just went ahead and started putting my thoughts on paper, with a view to make edits later if any big mechanical surprises were forthcoming, and well, they weren't. This is a little concerning actually, because there's quite a few point-and-click adventure games that I'm a fan of and would like to cover here one day. So I guess I'll be referring back to this section a lot. But hey, gotta keep that channel engagement up, right? So, where to start? Well, being a point-and-click adventure game is probably this game's biggest strength and weakness. Since this is clearly just a massive interactive book, the removal of anything that could be called a real game mechanic really pushes the story to the forefront. Sorry Diablo, but left-clicking a lot doesn't count as an actual game mechanic. These games live or die on the strength of their stories and characters, and that's probably why so many of them were works of comedy genius back in the day. Of course, there were intrigues, mysteries, and plenty of magical worlds to explore, but nothing will endear you to a character faster than making you laugh. Though there is something of a gamble here, as missing with your jokes will transform a character from lovable into outright annoying in a heartbeat. Isn't that right, Nathan? So, this is probably the area where I'll have the most criticism of the game and the genre as a whole. I mentioned at the start that I'd been intrigued by this game since it first came out, and despite several attempts, I just hadn't been able to finish it. And that's because, as much as I do enjoy them, point-and-click adventure games can be a real slog to get through sometimes. So let's start with a big disclaimer here and say that The Longest Journey is 100% a product of its era and genre. The game was clearly never about redefining what adventure games were. It's just doing all the things that adventure games have been doing since Enchanted Scepters came out in 1984, and other genre classics such as Day of the Tentacle and Full Throttle were doing after that. It fits comfortably into a defined category with a clear target audience, and tells its unique story to them. And in that regard, it 100% succeeded. The Longest Journey was enough of a commercial success to warrant it getting a sequel greenlit, and has a dedicated fanbase that kickstarted its final installment to a sum of over $1 million. It's highly regarded among genre fans and retro game enthusiasts in general, and this first one especially is considered by many to still be the best of the three games. So while judged by its own standards, The Longest Journey is just fine. That doesn't mean we can't look at it critically with the knowledge we have about interactive storytelling now, and consider why it might be somewhat dated and even inaccessible to new players today. Adventure games have two very simple mechanics: lock and key puzzles and conversation trees. A lot of conversation trees. Like so many— wait, I've done this bit before, haven't I? And since we're talking about conversations here, that means dialogue trees. A lot of dialogue trees. Like so many dialogue trees. There are problems with both of these, at least in the form they take in the original game. The first is that the puzzles are nonsensical, overly complex, and based on completely alien logic. And the second is that the dialogue trees are mostly pointless. I mentioned this in my vampire review, but dialogue trees aren't really any kind of mechanic, and don't really serve any purpose. You know from the outset that you're going to click through every option, and that it's probably going to mean sitting through long exposition-filled information dumps, which are easily one of the worst ways a developer can convey information about their story to their player. I'm sorry, Mr. Kojima, it's just not cool. Now, in defense of these conversations, they do flesh out the characters, the setting, have lots of witty banter, and great voice acting. There is actually a really interesting puzzle when April first arrives in Arcadia based around them. You see, she can't understand anyone there, but going through the actions of speaking to this character, Vestrum Tobias, she enables the magic of Arcadia's All-Tongue to enter her, and is then able to communicate with him. While this is a very specific situation, I wonder if there's more uses for this kind of mechanic in a dialogue tree, a way of teasing information out of an NPC with the right cues at the right moment. Even so, these things can be a slog to get through, and I often found myself sighing when I clicked on an NPC and found a long list of topics waiting for me, while wondering just how long I'd be sitting through each one before I could move on to the next. So, yeah, I'm a very show don't tell kind of guy, I love how in games like Half-Life 2 and in the recent Doom games, you're only really exposed to the mission critical parts of the lore, and the rest is left for you to figure out for yourself. Doom 2016 handles this somewhat clumsily through codex entries that you have to take yourself out of the game to go and read, while Half-Life 2 places the information around you in the world for you to find if you're willing to stop, smell the roses, and actually listen to what this arsehole is saying from time to time. I'm not saying that The Longest Journey doesn't have plenty of environmental and implied storytelling. If you're actually watching this video versus having me on in the background while you get on with your life, hopefully you can see just how much more there is to learn about these places hidden all about them. From the bums and the junkies in Metro Central, to the paintings in the Temple of the Balance, to the weird alien scenery of the Mayhem City, you really are drinking in a good percentage of this story through your eyes. On the other hand though, April can basically ask her friends to explain their entire backstories and the events that led them to meeting and becoming friends if she wants to. These conversations are thankfully optional, though you may not know that in a first playthrough. It's nice that the writers thought all of this stuff up and that they took the time to add it for those who want to know, but honestly, I think it would have been better to leave it out completely and let people make up that part of the story for themselves. That kind of emergent narrative is the real gold of interactive storytelling. That being said, there are some absolutely killer moments in this game, such as April's conversation with her estranged mother. It's made pretty clear at the start of the game that April didn't exactly leave home under the best of circumstances, and at one point in a police station, you have access to a video caller and a chance to call April's parents. I've spent a lot of time praising the great characterization and voice acting in this game, but I think this moment in particular is a real standout for everyone involved. It just really packs a whole punch, and tells us so much about our girl, and just how messed up she is in a relatively short and well-delivered conversation. So, the conversations, while very funny, entertaining, and outright tear-jerking at times, are also heavy-handed and long-winded in places. I mean, I think it's cool that someone saw fit to write several parables for the Elations to share with April, but I really didn't want to have to sit through them all. I don't want to put anyone off playing the game by saying this, but be prepared going in. It's worth it, but you may need to play in shorter bursts over a longer period to get through all this. Now the puzzles are also an area where I have a lot of issues, though a lot of those are simply resolved by having access to a smartphone while playing the game, or just tabbing out into a browser when you're done having your time wasted by this thing. I by no means think that you should be following a guide all the way through, but just so you know, when you finally had enough of trying to figure out what you're supposed to do because you missed some tiny little thing hidden somewhere in some obscure part of the scenery, I won't blame you for looking it up in a guide and skipping on through to the next part. As much as I like a challenge, there's such a thing as a bitter victory, and in the end we only have so much time to dedicate to games each day, and it's supposed to be fun. Now, I'm not advocating for hand-holding here. Trust me, nothing about this game would be improved by waypoints or any of the other so-called quality of life improvements of modern games. But I am advocating for things to just be fair. Old school adventure games, to put it simply, are not fair. They are not fair in the same way a magic trick isn't fair. I'm actually a pretty competent card magician myself, and one of the main reasons that magic tricks work is because the spectator doesn't actually know what the outcome is going to be. In fact, the big number 2 rule of magic, next to the obvious never tell them how it's done, is never repeat a trick, or at least never repeat it in the same way. I mean, imagine just how much more difficult a jigsaw would be if you didn't know what the final picture was. And now imagine that the final picture is completely alien architecture for which you have absolutely no frame of reference. That's what puzzles feel like in a lot of these old games. It's not every puzzle. In fact, there are plenty of simple lock and key situations, or moments where the answer isn't quite so obscure. But there's a very early puzzle involving a clamp and an inflatable duck that you use to fish a screwdriver or something out of some easy to miss location. It's just ridiculous. I mean, mad respect and kudos to anyone who managed to figure it out by themselves back in the day, but I really wouldn't have had that kind of patience. Now there's definitely some fun to be had here, but it starts all mixed up. For example, you're going to be able to pick up things and examine them in April's apartment, long before you have any idea that you need anything to achieve anything else. It's pretty fun, for example, examining this little toy of April's and finding all the little pieces that are hidden on it. But you have to ask yourself, why are you doing any of this at all? The issue then is that when a puzzle does present itself, the solution could be in any one of any number of previously visited locations, with something minor that you've overlooked. Just something as simple as finding April's timesheet so she can get paid can be something of a conundrum on your first run. This does become less of an issue later in the game. Of course, when April is on some tropical island in Arcadia, it's safe to assume that the solution to any puzzle there isn't back in the Merum City or somewhere on Stark, as she has no means to get back to either of those places. Eventually though, this level of abstract thinking leads to you just trying every object on every unlikely lock, and when that fails, trying to combine everything with everything else to see if something sticks. This was actually a regular complaint leveled at these old school adventure games back in the days of glossy video game magazines. So hey, at least we know gaming journalists kinda sucked at the games they played back then too, huh? Since we're on the subject of time wasting, I need to point out this whole skit in the library on Arcadia later in the game. April needs to gain access to information from a specific book, and you basically have to click through the same conversation lines each time with this librarian so you can select which book you want him to get for you, then suffer through this unskippable animation as he dodders off to collect it, bring it back to you and open it so that you can read it. And given there's several books and only one of them contains the quest critical information, it can be annoying as hell watching him go through this routine every time. So yeah, between the conversations and the puzzles, it really can feel like this game is wasting your time, which may explain why it took me until now and some external motivation in the form of this YouTube channel to finally get through it. It's not that these things are objectively bad. And it's not like every puzzle is like navigating alien terrain while wearing a blindfold, but it can wear you down after a while. So yeah, baby steps, and keep your phone to hand. Unless you really get a kick out of puzzles like this, don't make yourself suffer for the sake of enjoying the story. Most of what I've said here is addressed more or less 100% in the sequels, so it's clear I'm not the only one who felt this way, and this kind of feedback made its way back to the developers. Reading back through this, it sounds a lot more negative than I intended, but I do think that it's fair. Don't leave here thinking I had a bad time though. Hopefully all the great stuff I said about this game prior has made it clear that despite its flaws, I really do enjoy it. It's taken me several attempts to get to the end of The Longest Journey, but I can honestly say it was worth it in the end. As a story first kind of gamer, this is definitely a story worth experiencing, and these are absolutely characters worth meeting. It has some problems, at least when gauged by the standards of modern games, but it has by no means aged badly. Take your time with it and don't be shy about looking up the answers of a few puzzles along the way, and you're going to have a great time with this. Portal fiction is very often the story of a journey back home. Often the protagonist is lost in another world and cut off from their loved ones and family and looking to get back to their status quo. I've always had something of a problem with this. After all, a journey changes a person, and most stories have an element of growing up and becoming a different person in the process, which leaves me wondering if the place they came from is even their home anymore. As someone who lives on the other side of the world to the country he was born in, this is actually a question I've had to put to myself once or twice. And in truth, I don't think I could ever see myself returning back to the life I left behind. I don't even think it's there anymore. I have lots of good memories, and there are people there that I miss, but life has to move forward, and I'm more content and fulfilled here than I ever was. Characters like April likewise may have family and friends back in their homes, but by the end of their journeys in the new world, they have friends there too. And after discovering a magical realm like Arcadia, could you really just go back to working 8 till 6 knowing that once upon a time, far, far away, all of creation hinged on your actions? As April leaves the Tower of the Balance, her monumental quest finally complete, we see herself musing on these very thoughts before she finally vanishes through a shift. I wonder where she'll go from here, and who she shall become. The story of April Ryan and the Balance is over. But the story of Stark and Arcadia is far, far from finished. Time will pass in both the real world and in these wonderful other worlds. A year after The Longest Journey released, both the Xbox and the PlayStation 2 arrived to take the world by storm. And as 3D gaming transformed and opened up so many more options, so the adventure game became something new. In Stark and Arcadia, 10 years shall pass, the world shall change, and a new threat will rise, as an oppressive force comes to Mercuria, hell-bent on regulating the magical creatures therein. A rebel force will rise, led by a very familiar face. And in Stark, a young girl will stumble into a mystery and a conspiracy involving a giant tech corporation and discover that the world is far more than she could possibly imagine. Next time, we're going to meet Zoe Castiel as The Longest Journey continues with Dreamfall. Well, hello there. What are you still doing here? Trying to figure out what's changed in my room since the last time we were here? Well, thanks for coming back and sticking it out till the end. If you're new here, then don't forget to like, subscribe and comment on the video, and maybe take a look around at what else is available here. I must apologise for taking so long with this one. I've had a lot on my plate since I got back from the UK, and with some shaky mental health, I found it difficult to concentrate on content creation. Either way, things should be back on track now. Peace out everyone. See you next time.